Welcome to Thueringer, 4th Arming Simulator 15. We now continue in Zane Gray's The Desert of Wheat, Chapter 12. That was the one great word needed to reconcile Kurt to his father. The night had grown still except for the murmuring of the men. Smoke veiled the horizon. Kurt felt an intense and terrible loneliness. He was indeed alone in the world. A hard, tight contraction of throat choked back a sob. If only he could have had a word with his father, but no grief. Nothing could detract from the splendid truth of his father's last message. In the black hours soon to come, Kurt would have that to sustain him. Chapter 13. The bright sun of the morning disclosed that wide, rolling region of the bend to be a dreary, blackened waste surrounding one great wheat field, rich and mellow and golden. Kurt Dorn's neighbor, Olson, in his kind and matter-of-fact way, making obligations seem slight, took charge of Kurt's affairs and made the necessary and difficult decisions. Nothing must delay the harvesting and transporting of the wheat. The women folk arranged for the burial of old Chris Dorn. Kurt sat and moved about in a gloomy kind of trance for a day and a half, until his father was laid to rest beside his mother in the little graveyard on the windy hill. After that, his mind slowly cleared. He kept to himself the remainder of that day, avoiding the crowd of harvesters camping in the yard in the adjacent field, and at sunset he went to a lonely spot on the verge of the valley, where with sad eyes he watched the last rays of sunlight fade over the blackened hills. All these hours had seemed consecrated to his father's memory, to remembered acts of kindness and of love, of the relationship that had gone and would never be again. Reproach and remorse had abided with him until that sunset hour when the load eased off his heart. Next morning he went out to the wheat field. What a wonderful harvesting scene greeted Kurt Dorn. Never had its like been seen in the Northwest, nor perhaps in any other place. A huge pall of dust, chaff, and smoke hung over the vast wheat field, and the air seemed charged with a roar. The glaring gold of the wheat field appeared to be crisscrossed everywhere with bobbing black streaks of horses, bays, blacks, whites, and reds, by big, moving, painted machines, lifting arms and puffing straw, by immense wagons piled high with sheaves of wheat, lumbering down to the smoking engines and the threshers that sent long streams of dust and chaff over the lifting straw stacks, by wagons following the combines to pick up the plump brown sacks of wheat, and by a string of empty wagons coming in from the road. Olson was rushing 30 combine threshers, 3-engine threshing machines, 40 wagon teams, and over 100 men well known to him. There was a guard around the field. This unprecedented harvest had attracted many spectators from the little towns. They had come in cars and on horseback and on foot. Olson trusted no man on that field except those he knew. The wonderful wheat field was cut into 1,000 squares and angles and lanes and curves. The big whirring combines passed one another, stopped and waited and turned out of the way, leaving everywhere little patches and cubes of standing wheat that soon fell before the onslaught of the smaller combines. This scene had no regularity. It was one of confusion, of awkward halts, delays, hurries, of accident. The wind blew clouds of dust and chaff alternately clearing one space to cloud another. And a strange roar added the last heroic touch to this heroic field. It was indeed the roar of battle, men and horses governing the action of machinery and all fighting time. For in delay was peril to the wheat. Once Kurt ran across the tireless and implacable Olson. He seemed a man of dust and sweat and fury. "She's half cut and over 20,000 bushels on to the railroad," he exclaimed, "and we're speeding up." "Olson, I don't get what's going on," replied Kurt. "All this is like a dream." "Wake up, you'll be out of debt and a rich man in 3 days," added Olson, and went his way. In the afternoon, Kurt set out to work as he had never worked in his life. There was need of his strong hands in many places, but he could not choose any one labor and stick by it for long. He wanted to do all. It was as if this was not a real and wonderful harvest of his father's greatest wheat yield, but something that embodied all years, all harvests, his father's death, the lifting of the old hard debt, the days when he had trod the fields barefoot, and this day when, strangely enough, all seemed over for him. Peace dwelt with him, yet no hope. Behind his calm, he could have found the old dread, but he cared to look deeply. Or had he cared to look deeply? He loved these heroic workers of the fields. It had been given to him, a great task, to be the means of creating a test for them, his neighbors under a ban of suspicion, and now he could swear they were as true as the gold of the waving wheat. More than a harvest was this most strenuous and colorful of all times ever known in the Bend. It had a significance that uplifted him. It was American. First, Kurt began to load bags of wheat as they fell from the whirring combines into the wagons. For his powerful arms, a full bag containing 2 bushels was like a toy for a child. With a lift and a heave, he threw a bag onto a wagon. They were everywhere, these brown bags, dotting the stubble field, appearing as if by magic in the wake of the machines. They rolled off the platforms. This toil, because it was hard and heavy, held Kurt for an hour, but it could not satisfy his enormous hunger to make that whole harvest his own. He passed to pitching sheaves of wheat, and then to driving in the wagons. From that he progressed to a seat on one of the immense combines, where he drove 24 horses. No driver there was any surer than Kurt of his aim with the little stones he threw to spur a lagging horse. Kurt had felt this when, as a boy, he had begged to be allowed to try his hand. He liked the shifty cloud of fragrant chaff, now and then blinding and choking him, and he liked the steady, rhythmic tramps of hoofs and the roaring whir of the great, complicated machine. It fascinated him to see the wide swath of nodding wheat tremble and sway and fall and go sliding up into the inside of that grinding maw and come out, straw and dust and chaff, and a slender stream of gold filling the bags. This day Kurt Dorn was gripped by the unknown. Some far-off instinct of future drove him, set his spiritual need, and made him register with his senses all that was so beautiful and good and heroic in the scene about him. Strangely, now and then a thought of Lenore Anderson entered his mind and made sudden havoc. It tended to retard action. He trembled and thrilled with the realization that every hour brought closer the meeting he could not avoid. And he discovered that it was whenever this memory recurred that he had to leave off his present task and rush to another. Only thus could he forget her. The late afternoon found him feeding sheaves of wheat to one of the steam threshers. He stood high upon a platform and pitched sheaves from the wagons upon the sliding track of the ponderous, rattling threshing machine. The engine stood off 50 yards or more, connected by an endless driving belt to the thresher. Here indeed were whistle and roar and whir, and the shout of laborers, and the smell of smoke, sweat, dust, and wheat. Kurt had arms of steel. If they tired, he never knew it. He toiled, and he watched the long spout of chaff and straw as it streamed from the thresher to lift, magically, a glistening, ever-growing stack. And he felt, as a last and cumulative change, his physical effort and the physical adjuncts of the scene passed into something spiritual, into his heart and his memory. The end of that harvest time came as a surprise to Kurt. Obsessed with his own emotions, he had actually helped to cut the wheat and harvest it. He had seen it go swath by swath. He had watched the huge wagons lumber away and the huge straw stacks rise without realizing that the hours of this wonderful harvest were numbered. Sight of Olson coming in from across the field and the sudden cessation of roar and action made Kurt aware of the end. It seemed a calamity, but Olson was smiling through his dust-caked face. About him were relaxation, an air of finality, and a subtle pride. "We're through," he said. "She tallies 38,741 bushels. It's too bad the old man couldn't live to hear that." Olson gripped Kurt's hand and wrung it. "Boy, I reckon you ought to take that a little cheerfuler," he went on. "But, well, it's been a hard time. The men are leaving now. In 2 hours, the last wagons will unload at the railroad. The wheat will all be in the warehouse, and our worries ended." I hope so," responded Kurt. He seemed overcome with a passionate longing to show his gratitude to Olson, but the words would not flow. I don't know how to thank you. All my life we bait the IWW," interposed the farmer heartily. "And now, what'll you do, Dorn?" "Why, I'll hustle to Kylo, get my money, send you a check for yourself and men, pay off the debt to Anderson, and then—" Kurt did not conclude his speech. His last words were thought-provoking. "It turned out well," said Olson with satisfaction. Shaking hands again with Kurt, he strode back to his horses. At last, the wide, sloping field was bare except for the huge straw stacks. A bright procession lumbered down the road, led by the long strings of wagons filled with brown bags. A strange silence had settled down over the farm. The wheat was gone. That waving stretch of gold had fallen to the thresher, and the grain had been hauled away. The neighbors had gone, leaving Kurt rich in bushels of wheat, and richer for the hearty farewells and the grips of horny hands. Kurt's heart was full. It was evening. Kurt had finished his supper. Already he had packed a few things to take with him on the morrow. He went out to the front of the house. Stars were blinking. There was a low hum of insects from the fields. He missed the soft silken rustle of the wheat. And now it seemed he could sit there in the quiet darkness, in that spot which had been made sweet by Lenore Anderson's presence, and think of her, the meeting soon to come. The feeling abiding with him then must have been happiness, because he was not used to it. Without deserving anything, he had asked a great deal of fate, and lo, it had been given to him. All was well that ended well. He realized now the terrible depths of despair into which he had allowed himself to be plunged. He had been weak, wrong, selfish. There was something that guided events. He needed to teach himself all this with strong and repeated force, so that when he went to give Lenore Anderson the opportunity to express her gratitude, to see her sweet face again, and to meet the strange, warm glance of her blue eyes, so mysterious and somehow mocking. He could be a man of restraint, of pride, like any American, like any other college man she knew. This was no time for a man to leave a girl bearing the burden of his unsolicited love, haunted perhaps by a generous reproach that she might have been a little to blame. He had told her the truth, and so far he had been dignified. Now let him bid her goodbye, leaving no sorrow for her, and, once out of her impelling presence, let come what might come. He could love her then. He could dare what he had never dared. He could surrender himself to the furious, insistent sweetness of passion that was sheer bliss in its expression. He could imagine kisses on the red lips that were not for him. A husky shout from somewhere in the rear of the house diverted Kurt's attention. He listened. It came again. His name. It seemed a strange call from out of the troubled past that had just ended. He hurried through the house to the kitchen. The woman stood holding a lamp, staring at Jerry. Jerry appeared to have sunk against the wall. His face was pallid, with drops of sweat standing out, with distorted, quivering lower jaw. He could not look at Kurt. He could not speak. With shaking hand, he pointed towards the back of the house. Filled with nameless dread, Kurt rushed out. He saw nothing unusual, heard nothing. Rapidly, he walked out through the yard, and suddenly he saw a glow in the sky above the barns. Then he ran so that he could get an unobstructed view of the valley. The instant he obtained this, he halted as if turned to stone. The valley was a place of yellow light. He stared. With the wheat fields all burned, what was the meaning of such a big light? That broad flare had a center low down on the valley floor. As he gazed, a monstrous flame leaped up, lighting colossal pillars of smoke that swirled upward and showed plainer than in day the big warehouse and lines of freight cars at the railroad station 8 miles distant. My word, gasped Kurt. The warehouse! My wheat! On fire! Clear and unmistakable was the horrible truth. Kurt heard the roar of the sinister flames. Transfixed he stood there, at first hardly able to see and to comprehend. For miles the valley was as light as a noonday. An awful beauty attended the scene. How lurid and sinister the red heart of that fire, how weird and hellish and impressive of destruction those black mountain-high clouds of smoke. He saw the freight cars disappear under this fierce, blazing and smoking ball. He watched for what seemed endless moments. He saw the changes of that fire, swift and terrible, and only then did Kurt Dorn awaken to the full sense of the calamity. All that work, Olson's sacrifice, and the farmers, my father's death, all for nothing, whispered Kurt. They only waited, those fiends, to fire the warehouse and the cars. The catastrophe had fallen. The wheat was burning. He was ruined. His wheatland must go to Anderson. Kurt thought first and most poignantly of the noble farmers who had sacrificed the little in their wheat fields to save the much in his. Never could he repay them. Then he became occupied with a horrible heat that seemed to have come from the burning warehouse to all his pulses and veins, and to his heart and his soul. This fiendish work, as it had been forecast, was the work of the IWW. Behind it was Glidden, and perhaps behind him was the grasping black lust of German might. Kurt's loss was no longer abstract or problematical. It was a loss so real and terrible that it confounded him. He shook and gasped and reeled. He wrung his hands and beat his breast while the tumult swayed him, the physical hate at last yielding up its significance. What then was his great loss? He could not tell. The thing was mighty, like the sense of terror and loneliness in the black night. Not the loss for his farmer neighbors, so true in this hour of trial. Not the loss of his father, nor the wheat, nor the land, nor his ruined future. But it must be a loss, incalculable and insupportable to his soul. His great ordeal had been the need, a terrible and incomprehensible need, to kill something intangible in himself. He hadn't meant to do it, and now the need was shifted, subject to a baser instinct. If there was German blood in him, poisoning the very wells of his heart, he could have spilled it, and so, whether living or dead, have repudiated the taint. That was now clear in his consciousness, but a baser spark had ignited all the primitive passion of his forebears. He felt burning and driving within him. He felt no noble fire. He longed to live, to have 100-fold his strength and fury, to be gifted with a genius for time and place and bloody deed, to have the war gods set him 1,000 opportunities to beat with iron mace and cut with sharp bayonet and rend with hard hand, to kill and kill and kill the hideous thing that was German. Chapter 14. Kurt rushed back to the house. Encountering Jerry, he ordered him to run and saddle a couple of horses. Then Kurt got his revolver and a box of shells, and throwing on his coat, he hurried to the barn. Jerry was leading out the horses. It took but short work to saddle them. Jerry was excited and talkative. He asked Kurt many questions, which excited few replies. When Kurt threw himself into the saddle, Jerry yelled, "Which way?" "Down the trail," replied Kurt, and was off. "Ah, we'll break our necks," came Jerry's yell after him. Kurt had no fear of the dark. He knew that trail almost as well by night as by day. His horse was a mettlesome colt that had not been worked during the harvest, and he plunged down the dim, winding trail as if, indeed, to verify Jerry's fears. Presently, the thin, pale line that was the trail disappeared on the burned wheat ground. Here Kurt was at fault as to direction, but he did not slacken the pace for that. He heard Jerry pounding along in the rear, trying to catch up. The way the colt jumped ditches and washes and other obstructions proved his keen sight. Kurt let him go, and then the ride became both perilous and thrilling. Kurt could not see anything on the blackened earth, but he knew from the contour of the hills just about where to expect to reach the fence and the road. He did not pull the horse too soon. When he found the gate, he waited for Jerry, who could be heard calling from the darkness. Kurt answered him. "Here's the gate," yelled Kurt as Jerry came galloping up. "Good road all the way now." "Lickety-cut, then," shouted Jerry, to whom the pace had evidently communicated enthusiasm. The ride then became a race, with Kurt drawing ahead. Kurt could see the road, a broad, pale belt, dividing the blackness on either side, and he urged the colt to a run. The wind cut short Kurt's breath, beat at his ears, and roared about them. Closer and closer drew the red flare of the dying fire, casting long rays of light into Kurt's eyes. The colt was almost run out when he entered the circle of reddish flare. Kurt saw the glowing ruins of the elevators and a long, fiery line of boxcars burned to the wheels. Men were running and shouting round in front of the little railroad station, and several were on the roof with brooms and buckets. The freight house had burned, and evidently the station itself had been on fire. Across the wide street of the little village, the roof of a cottage was burning. Men were on top of it, beating the shingles. Hoarse yells greeted Kurt as he leaped out of the saddle. He heard screams of frightened women. On the other side of the burned boxcars, a long, thin column of sparks rose straight upward. Over the ruins of the elevators hung a pall of heavy smoke. Just then, Jerry came galloping up, his lean face red in the glow. "That you, Kurt? Say, the sons of guns are burning down the town." He leaped off. "Let me have your bridle. I'll tie the hosses up. Find out what we can do." Kurt ran here and there, possessed by impotent rage. The wheat was gone. That fact gave him a hollow, sickening pain. He met farmers he knew. They all threw up their hands at the sight of him. Not one could find a voice. Finally he met Olson. The little wheat farmer was white with passion. He carried a gun. "Hello, Dorn. Ain't this hell? They got your wheat," he said hoarsely. "Olson, how did it happen? Wasn't anybody set to guard the elevators?" "Yes, but the IWWs drove all the guards off but Grimm, and they beat him up bad. Nobody had nerve enough to shoot." "Olson, if I run into Glidden, I'll kill him," declared Kurt. "So will I. But Dorn, they're a hard crowd. They're over there on the side watching the fire, a gang of them. Soon as I can get the men together, we'll drive them out of town. There'll be a fight if I don't miss my guess. Hurry the men. Have all of them got their guns? Come on." "Not yet, Dorn. We're fighting fire yet. You and Jerry help all you can." Indeed, it appeared there was danger of more than one cottage burning. The exceedingly dry weather of the past weeks had made shingles like tinder, and wherever a glowing spark fell on them, there straightway was a smoldering fire. Water, a scarce necessity in that region, had been used until all wells and pumps became dry. It was fortunate that most of the roofs of the little village had been constructed of galvanized iron. Beating out blazes and glowing embers with brooms was not effective enough. When it appeared that the one cottage nearest the rain of sparks was sure to go, Kurt thought of the railroad water tank below the station. He led a number of men with buckets to the tank, and they soon drowned out the smoldering blazes. Meanwhile, the blazes from the boxcars died out, leaving only the dull glow from the red heap that had once been the elevators. However, this gave forth light enough for anyone to be seen a few rods distant. Sparks had ceased to fall, and from that source no further danger need be apprehended. Olson had been going from man to man, sending those who were not armed home for guns. So it came about that half an hour after Kurt's arrival, a score of farmers, villagers, and a few railroaders were collected in a group, listening to the pale-faced Olson. "Men, there's only a few of us, and there's hundreds, maybe in that IWW gang, but we've got to drive them off," he said doggedly. "There's no telling what they'll do if we let them hang around any longer. They know we're weak in numbers. We've got to do some shooting to scare them away." Kurt seconded Olson in a ringing voice. "They've threatened your homes," he said. "They've burned my wheat, ruined me. They were the death of my father. These are facts, I'm telling you. We can't wait for law or for militia. We've got to meet this IWW invasion. They have taken advantage of the war situation, and they're backed by German agents. It's now a question of our property. We've got to fight." The crowd made noisy and determined response. Most of them had small weapons. A few had shotguns or rifles. "Come on, men," called Olson. "I'll do the talking. And if I say shoot, why, you shoot." It was necessary to go around the long line of boxcars. Olson led the way with Kurt just back of him. The men spoke but little and in whispers. At the left end of the line, the darkness was thick enough to make objects indistinct. Once around the corner, Kurt plainly descried a large, dark crowd of men. whose faces showed red in the glow of the huge pile of embers, which was all that remained of the elevators. They did not see Olson's men. "Hold on," whispered Olson. "If we get in a fight here, we'll be in a bad place. We've nothing to hide behind. Let's go off, more to the left, and come up behind those freight cars on the switches. That'll give us cover, and we'll have the IWWs in the light." So he led off to the left, keeping in the shadow, and climbed between several lines of freight cars, all empty, and finally came out behind the IWWs. Olson led to within 50 yards of them and was halted by some observant member of the gang who sat with the others on top of the flat car. This man's yells stilled the coarse talk and laughter of the gang. "What's that?" shouted a cold, clear voice with authority in it. Kurt thought he recognized the voice, and it caused a bursting, savage sensation in his blood. "Here's a bunch of farmers with guns!" yelled the man from the flat car. Olson halted his force near one of the detached lines of boxcars, which he probably meant to take advantage of in case of a fight. "Hey, you IWWs!" he shouted with all his might. There was a moment's silence. "There's no IWWs here," replied the authoritative voice. Kurt was sure now that he recognized Glidden's voice. Excitement and anger then gave place to deadly rage. "Who are you?" yelled Olson. "We're tramps watching the fire," came the reply. "You set that fire." "No, we didn't."